Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, breastfeeding. For World Breastfeeding Week, Meghan Azad, who leads the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center in Canada, joins me to talk about all things breast milk and breastfeeding, from what makes human milk so unique to the barriers and challenges of breastfeeding here in the U.S. and around the world. Let's listen. Meghan Azad, thank you so much for coming to us on Public Health on Call. How are you?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba in Canada in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health. And I'm also a research scientist at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba, and my lab studies very broadly breastfeeding and breast milk. So I come to this area as a biochemist, so I'm really interested in all the different components in the breast milk. But I have since then also trained in epidemiology, so we have an interest in the public health aspects and implications of breastfeeding, and also in understanding how we best support families to breastfeed.
And you came to us and you said, by the way, World Breastfeeding Week is coming up. I think this could be an interesting topic. Tell us about World Breastfeeding Week.
Exactly. So every year, the first week of August is celebrated around the world as World Breastfeeding Week. They have a theme every year. This one is creating sustainable support systems. So really looking at how we support breastfeeding. But it's a reason, an excuse to talk about breastfeeding, to celebrate it around the world, and to really spread awareness about the importance of breastfeeding and the many different aspects of it.
I think it's really interesting that you're coming into this with a biochemistry lens. Can you tell us what makes human milk unique?
Yeah, so my interest in breastfeeding came from my prior research on the microbiome. So that's all the bacteria and microbes that live in and on our bodies. And I have been studying the microbiomes of babies and how it first gets established and how that's important for many aspects of health, from metabolism to immune development. And one of the early discoveries in that research, which is back over a decade ago now when I was a postdoc, was that breastfeeding is really important for developing the microbiome early in life. And so that made me ask the question, why? What's in breast milk that's so important to our microbes? And so human milk, to your point, is very unique. All mammals make milk. So mammary gland is actually the origin of the word mammals. So all mammals are making milk for their babies, but the milk of different species is super different and sort of tailored to each species. So if you imagine, for example, a baby calf, it's born and within minutes, it's up and wobbling around. So its milk is optimized for muscle development because it really quickly needs to build strong muscles. So it has high protein, for example. Whereas if you imagine a human baby, we know they're not up walking around for months. They're actually spending a lot of their early weeks and months sleeping and devoting their energy to brain development. So human milk is optimized for brain development. It has specific fats that are optimal for the brain. And you can extend that to all sorts of different species. Seals are one of my favorite examples. If you imagine a baby seal, it can be born on an ice floe, and it only has a couple of days to consume milk from its mother before it's into the freezing cold water. So it has really high fat content for developing this thick blubber layer. So milk is super optimized to every different species, which I think makes it very fascinating.
So not only are you looking at the components of breast milk, you're also studying the public health impacts through epidemiology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So when I was sort of entering my postdoc years, I had been doing very detailed biochemistry research. But to me, that was not completely fulfilling. I really wanted to do things that could more immediately impact people and populations. And so I learned about epidemiology as a field. I actually hadn't even heard of it before, but I started asking people around, I want to do something closer to populations. And one of them said to me, you thought of epidemiology? So I did a degree in that as I was starting up my own lab, actually, which was fun. I was defending my epidemiology master's thesis as my first graduate students were doing theirs. But yeah, the extension of that has been not only looking at the components of milk, which are really important, but also what do we do in a population sense to support breastfeeding? And a phrase or a quote that I really like is that breastfeeding is not an individual responsibility. it's actually a societal responsibility, and it's not individuals but communities who breastfeed. Because if you think of a new mom and all the stresses that come with having a new baby, if she's taking the decision, I want to breastfeed, like that's the first step, but it's not always automatic and easy and problem-free, right? And I think that's actually some of the messaging we need to do better at in public health. I think we've done a good job at giving the message that breast milk is really great, breastfeeding is good, moms hear that and they want to do it, but they don't necessarily understand, especially first time around, that just because it's natural doesn't mean it's automatic or easy. And so what happens when a mom has issues with breastfeeding? And especially in our modern society, because historically we had intergenerational households, right? So you would probably have an auntie or a mom or a grandma living with you who has done this before and could step in and help. But nowadays we know that's not the reality for most families. So thinking about where do people get help? And also even aspects of, what does it mean to have a breastfeeding friendly community? Like one aspect of that is that everybody, whether they have kids or not, just feels like, oh, this is how babies feed. It's not a big deal. Whereas we live in a society where a lot of people, give you a strange look if you're breastfeeding out in public or maybe not appreciate the importance of it. So we're working on things from that angle too. For example, educating kids from a really young age, like how do babies eat? And so then when they grow up, become parents or not, they'll just accept that this is a normal part of feeding in families and societies.
What about the policy aspect of this? And I think particularly around supporting mothers as they may have to go back to work. We know the U.S., unlike Canada and maybe some other places, the U.S. does not have super breastfeeding friendly policies.
Absolutely. And that's a huge part of this whole, if we think from individuals to households to communities to policies. Because, for example, paid leave. There's many reasons to have paid leave for new parents, but breastfeeding is one of them. You obviously can't be breastfeeding your baby all day long if you're back at work after a couple of weeks. And so that's a policy decision that needs to happen at a higher level. And you mentioned Canada, and we do have longer paid leave in Canada. I guess most countries do compared to the US, but, it's still not perfect. So I'm working with people to see if we can advance policy around the insurance coverage for breast pumps and lactation consultants, because right now breast pumps are not considered like an insured medical device, which is a problem. And the coverage for lactation care is really specialized. They'll cover if you're going to see a medical doctor in a clinic, but not if a lactation consultant, like a certified consultant, comes to your home and gives you some care. And that's important because there's not enough doctors with specialties in breastfeeding lactation to serve all the population of people who needs it. Lactation consultants play a really important role there, and right now they're not covered by insurance. So you're absolutely right. The policy is so important.
And I do want to say that's one place where the U.S. may be ahead of you because breast pumps are covered by insurance here, which is great. What are some of the other barriers or challenges mothers might face around the world to breastfeeding?
Right. So we've talked about policies, and that differs in different areas. We talked a little bit about stigma. So the idea that some countries culturally are more accepting than others of breastfeeding. A favorite story I've read since I got into this field was a reporter who moved to Mongolia from the US for a year because of her spouse's job. And she wrote a blog saying, you would not believe it, in Mongolia, everyone's on board with breastfeeding. They actually have this sort of belief that the longer you breastfeed as an infant, the better you'll grow up to be as a wrestler. And wrestling is like their national sport. So everyone thinks this is amazing. You go in a taxi, you're breastfeeding, no problem. Like people will actually share their milk with other families if there's extra. Like everyone's just on board. And that makes such a difference, she was saying, to how you feel breastfeeding out in public or in the area. So culture can be an issue. And maybe another example of culture is there are some countries in the world, Philippines is one example, where feeding formula is seen as a wealth status symbol, which is almost opposite to other places in the world. But because they have that understanding of, richer people can afford formula, so I want to feed formula to my baby because that would be the best thing to do. Like that's a cultural understanding or issue that needs to be tackled. So I guess some other barriers, there certainly are issues for new moms if they have low supply or perceived low supply is another issue. Like I think there are circumstances now where people are so wanting to breastfeed and getting so concerned about it, they're almost overthinking it or over worrying and wanting to know exactly what volume their baby is getting, which of course, if you're pumping, you can measure, but if you're feeding at the breast, you don't know. And actually, that's okay. For many millenniums, we have been feeding that way, but people want to know. And so this overthinking and maybe over worrying can be an issue. We talked about going back to work. So all of these are circumstances. And I guess another special population to consider is premature babies. So if babies are born prematurely and have to stay in the hospital, they may not be able to be with their mothers all the time. And if they're so premature, they actually don't have the reflexes and muscle tone yet to feed at the breast. And those are some of the babies that actually most benefit from breast milk because they're at risk for many different chronic diseases early on. So if we can provide breast milk to those babies, that's really important. And so there's a whole other circumstance of sort of barriers and considerations in that population too.
Yeah, there can be kind of a little bit of fearfulness here in that, maybe people want to breastfeed and that's not available to them. That's not an option. Maybe they've adopted, maybe a mom can't breastfeed for a while. There are many different reasons why it may not be available. How can we do a good job of reassuring parents that fed is best, even though we know all the great things about breast milk?
One thing important to emphasize is that although there are recommendations, for example, the WHO indicates you should exclusively breastfeed to 6 months and then continue up to 2 years and beyond. Exclusive meaning nothing else, no formula, no food. But the data show any amount of breastfeeding is helpful. So the last thing I want is for a mom to see that recommendation and go, like, I'll never make it to 6 months. Why bother? Because any amount, even one day, like we've done research on babies who received breast milk just in the first couple days and then had to be formula fed, and we still see a difference in them in their blood pressure profiles 3 years later. And other way around too, we've seen, yes, longer breastfeeding might be associated with the lowest risks of asthma, for example, but any amount, 1 month, 2 months, every bit counts. And as well as you mentioned formula, so partial breastfeeding is also super beneficial. Like there are all these antibodies, hormones, your baby is still getting that, even if they're also having to be supplemented. So I think moms should feel very, proud of any amount of breastfeeding they're able to do because it all definitely counts. Like the numbers of antibodies, microbes, HMOs in just a tiny drop of breast milk is incredible. And so any amount you could do is absolutely worth it and having a benefit for your baby. Also, really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And so speaking of the premature babies, for example, in that case, it is super important that they're getting human milk. Ideally, their mom's own milk. And there's ways that moms can be supported to pump and then provide that milk to their baby through either tube feeding or bottle feeding. And so there are supports in place for that, but they do vary in different parts of the world. So I think that's an important area for more effort. For, you mentioned adoption or other circumstances, if baby can't latch, for example. So if it's a baby that can't latch or has issues with feeding, their pumping might also be an option. If it's an adoption type scenario, then of course we have substitutes for human milk, and those are constantly being improved through research that myself and other people are doing, right, to understand what is it about human milk or mother's own milk that works so well. And from that knowledge, we can help support other babies who aren't in a situation to receive their mother's own milk. So it is important to understand that everyone has their own circumstance, but really the research we're doing on breastfeeding and human milk can benefit all of those babies in the end. And so I think that's actually a really important point, is that in the past, breastfeeding and lactation really haven't been studied or prioritized for research. Many reasons you can imagine for that. Has been considered, a women's issue, which that in itself is like a really poor statement because babies are of all genders and need milk. So we are in a better situation now, I would say, than a decade ago when I started this research. So there have been, for example, funding calls prioritized from the NIH, from organizations like the Gates Foundation, specifically to understand human milk better. So I'm happy to see that shift happening, although we'll see where it goes under current circumstances. But yeah, this research is really important for all babies. And honestly, even beyond babies, like some of what we learn from human milk can be applied to treating other diseases. So there's all sorts of things we can learn from milk.
And tell us more about that.
Yeah. So for example, I mentioned that my interest in milk started with the microbiome. So we know that human milk, breast milk, is important for feeding not just the baby, but for their microbes too. So there are compounds in milk called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs, we call them for short. These are sugars. They're complex sugars that the baby doesn't actually digest. So the baby is unable to extract energy from these sugars, and yet they're really abundant. They are like more abundant than proteins in human milk. So that tells you they must be doing something important. And now we understand they're actually feeding the microbes. So the baby doesn't digest them, but their gut bacteria do. So we know these HMOs are shaping the infant gut microbiome. And so from there, some scientists are thinking, well, could they help adult microbiomes, especially in scenarios where the microbiome is disrupted? So a good example of that would be inflammatory bowel disease. We know the gut microbiome is sort of out of whack. So there's research going on. Could we use human milk oligosaccharides or compounds similar to those to restore and correct the microbiome of people with this condition? Other examples are around immune protection. So a newborn baby is born with a very immature immune system, and they rely on their mother's milk to protect them against infections in those first weeks of life because mother's milk contains antibodies. And so there has been research, particularly during the COVID pandemic. If there are moms who have had COVID and recovered or have been vaccinated, have they generated antibodies for COVID? And if their babies had enough, if they have extra milk, could those antibodies be somehow extracted and then used to protect people either with COVID or at high risk? So elderly populations, for example. So those are two examples of like what we learn from milk could actually be applied to help adults in other stages of life with other types of conditions.
I'm guessing we're not where you would say to someone, oh, you're having an upset stomach, maybe you should get some breast milk and drink it. We're not prescribing it.
Right, because breast milk is so many things, right? Like I like to call it a complex biological system. So it's got nutrients, of course, like this is where babies get their fats, proteins, carbohydrates, minerals, vitamins. But it's also got, I mentioned antibodies, HMOs, it's also got enzymes, hormones, like it's a mix of so many things. And we have to also remember it is sort of designed for babies. And babies are not just small adults. Babies have a certain environment in their gut. For example, their gut is, we call leaky in a good on-purpose way. So they're able to absorb compounds from breast milk that adults just wouldn't be able to because their gut is shut. So yes, it's not as simple as drink breast milk as an adult because we're really not designed anymore to drink breast milk as adults. But the things we learn from milk can be applied. That said, there is like a black market for breast milk for bodybuilders at the moment because they believe, oh, there's growth hormones, those are the things that we don't really condone because when you create a market like that, you might be incentivizing mothers, especially mothers of a low socioeconomic status, to, for example, sell their milk because they can make more money and then their baby's not getting it. And we need to emphasize milk is for babies. They need it most. But yes, the research we're doing could help us design therapies or advancements for other populations. And one other thing that we haven't talked about is there are maternal benefits to breastfeeding too. And that often gets forgotten, right? We talk about the baby and all the amazing things in breast milk for them, but lactation has benefits for moms too. So there is increasingly research on how lactation in a mom can help reduce the risk of metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes later on, and also certain cancers. So you're doing all of this for your baby, but it's also helping you. And that's one of the reasons we try to also support this. Even if you're not exclusively breastfeeding, any amount you do is helping you as well, lowering your risk of diabetes and cancer, for example. So that's pretty amazing.
So just to bring it back to the topic at hand, World Breastfeeding Week, you've mentioned that things have changed considerably in the last decade. What do you hope to see going forward?
Yeah, what I hope to see going forward is a lot more support at the community level for breastfeeding. So, it's wonderful that we have some medical doctors that specialize in breastfeeding medicine. And that's actually a relevant point to make. That specialty in medicine only exists in the last, 3 years. So before that, doctors could specialize in the brain or the kidney or the lungs or every part of the human body, but not lactation, which is a problem. So it's great that that is moving forward. There are now medical doctors training specifically in lactation, but there's, relatively few of them. And even as the years go on and that gets more, I think there'll never be enough medical doctors to handle the support the breastfeeding needs. So I mentioned earlier in Canada, we're trying to get insurance support to recognize that lactation care is super important. It should be covered. I hope those types of policies will change in the future. I hope that there'll be less stigma around things like breastfeeding in public or breastfeeding older toddlers, if that's what a mom and baby want to do. And I think that happens through more awareness, which is part of the mission of Breastfeeding Week, is just get people talking about lactation, excited about the science of human milk. And I hope, we'll learn more and more about milk and what is it that makes it so incredible and how can we pull from that to help all babies, all families, all people.
Meghan Azad, thank you so much for coming on a Public Health On Call.
My pleasure, and happy breastfeeding week.
Happy Breastfeeding Week.
Public Health On Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.